When one thinks of a weapon, one thinks a gun, a sword, a bow, a bomb, a grenade. But what about an insect? Not really, right? But the fact is that insects and other arthropods have been used in warfare for centuries, millennia even. Now, for those of you who don't know what arthropod means, an arthropod is essentially a member of the phylum Arthropoda, which refers to a very large group of animals that all share a certain number of characteristics, including an exoskeleton, or an exterior skeleton, which is basically a suit of armor, and jointed appendages. And arthropods include insects, spiders, scorpions, centipedes, millipedes, so basically all those creepy crawlies that you generally don't want to deal with in day-to-day life. So now that point's out of the way, we can talk about how arthropods have been used in warfare throughout the centuries. And first, we're going to talk about insects as just pain-inflicting weapons, basic weapons. Then we're going to talk about biological warfare and how arthropods have been used to spread disease. And finally, how insect byproducts have been used in warfare. Using insects as basic pain-inflicting weapons has been around for a really long time. In Lockwood's 2011 paper titled Insects as Weapons of War, Terror, and Torture, Lockwood suggests that cave-dwelling Paleolithic humans often tossed nests of stinging insects over the fences of enemy tribes, basically scaring them out into the open so that they could clobber them. Now, this was about 100,000 years ago, but this tactic works so well that you see it throughout history. The Mesopotamians did it, the Persians did it, the Greeks did it, the Mayans did it, and I'll talk about the Mayans in a second because that was a really funny story. Now, what these things are called are bee grenades, and this is when either a nest or a piece of pottery is filled with bees, stinging insects, scorpions, wasps, ants, any of these things, sealed, and then used basically as a grenade thrown over enemy defenses. Now, like I said, you see this in a lot of cultures, and probably one of my favorite uses of it was actually hiding these bee grenades in mannequins, which the Mayans did. The Mayans would hide these bee grenades in mannequins, station the mannequins along a defensive line, and then wait for the enemy to come in, smash it open, and get covered in bees. Great tactic, huh? Well, despite how long this actually lasted, there are a few cultures that didn't quite catch up until late in the game, the Roman Empire specifically. The Roman Empire actually didn't catch up to this trend until a little later in their empire. The troops of Emperor Septimus actually went up against Mesopotamia and went up against the specific city, which is in current Iraq. Now, these Mesopotamians had bee grenades, and they started throwing these at Septimus's troops until they eventually gave up and left the city alone. After this point, you really start to see the Roman Empire use this tactic to such an extent that they actually ran out of bees to use in agriculture and experienced a drought because they didn't have enough bees to pollinate their crops. You also see this much later in history in 10th century Europe. Now, during this time, it was very common for these bee grenades to be used as booby traps, especially in tunnels and under castles. And at this point, when an enemy stepped on the grenade or set off a tripwire, they'd get covered in insects. It was also very common for castles to be fortified with recesses or holes in the wall that these grenades could be pushed through so that they would fall on enemy forces surrounding the castle. It was also very common for these bee grenades to be used as catapult payloads, and they were also very common in naval arsenals until cannonballs became more popular. The last time you really see insects as being just weapons of force is in the Vietnam War. The Viet Cong was actually very fond of using this method. They would create holes in the ground filled with scorpions, or they'd use bee grenades, or they actually would reposition giant beehives along common trails to slow down U.S. troops. And when I say giant beehives, I don't mean big beehives, I mean giant bees. These things are very large and you don't want to get stung by them, and U.S. troops often did. So this is kind of why this tactic is so effective. Now, insects can also be used in a little less direct way, specifically as biological weapons. Many insects are very common vectors, and when I say vector, I mean carrier of disease. Mosquitoes, flies, all these things are vectors of disease. And this tactic has been around for a lot longer than you'd think, actually from around 5th century before Common Era. The Greeks first used this method by maneuvering defensive lines to force invaders to camp in marshes. And if you know anything about mosquitoes, mosquitoes like marshes. And these particular mosquitoes carried malaria. This tactic was also used in the U.S. Civil War on both sides. General John Johnson pinned down Union troops along a river where malaria was prevalent and actually managed to cut down Union forces by keeping them there for months at a time. Now, it's not really until the 14th century that you begin to see intentional infection. And this was actually created by the French. The French would catapult insect-infested livestock into an enemy castle so that the locals would get the disease and spread it around. Again, you see this in the Civil War, where Confederate surgeons would smuggle yellow fever-infested clothes up into the north and get people sick. Now, in later wars, you really don't see it quite as much, especially in World War I, because World War I was basically trench warfare. Everyone was dying of typhus anyway. Now, this held a lot of inspiration for later wars, especially World War II, because basically everyone who was in World War II tried to recreate the illnesses that affected World War I so much. And even though a few of them got their experiments off the ground, they really didn't get much further than the French did by leaving corpses where people could access them. The ones who really got off the ground with it, though, were the Japanese, who bred millions and millions and millions of fleas and then dropped them on Chinese towns with all these plagues and yellow fever and nastiness. And actually, it was so bad that the Chinese felt the effects of these diseases way, way after World War II ended. The last time you really see biological warfare with insects is with North Korea. And that's kind of a no-no subject because of the fact that even though there's a lot of evidence that the U.S. actually did drop disease-infected insects on North Korean towns, there was really not much investigation into it. And anyone who did investigate it was called a communist. So even though there's no conclusive evidence, it is very possible that U.S. actually used biological warfare with insects in the North Korean War. Finally, in the least direct way that insects can be used in warfare is by using insect byproducts. But this actually results in some of the funniest stories. Now, to clarify, insect byproduct means honey, venom, anything created by insects, basically. Now, venom's kind of an obvious one, because you tip an arrow in scorpion venom, and you've got a pretty potent weapon right there, because scorpion venom is actually very famous for being able to kill very old and very young or very sick people, because of the fact that it's very powerful in the first few hours that it's actually affecting a person. But really what I'm going to talk about most is honey. Now, all of you know what honey is. It's made by bees, it's sweet, it's nice, it's tasty. What you probably don't know is that there is a type of honey called mad honey, and this is basically when a bee takes nectar from a rhododendron or another kind of poisonous flower, concentrates the poison so much so in the honey that when you eat the honey, when a human eats the honey, they start getting delirium, they start having hallucinations, they start feeling nauseous. It's just not really all that pleasant. You can actually buy mad honey on the market nowadays, although I really don't suggest it. It's probably not a really good experience for you. But anyway, this mad honey has been used throughout history as a weapon. My favorite story is when the Roman Empire was chasing down Mithridates, king of Pontus, who fled to what is now known as Turkey. And the locals helped him by leaving bottles of mad honey along the road where the Romans followed. The Romans, not really thinking much about it, took the honey, ate it, and the locals came in and killed them while they were still hallucinating. And there are tons of cases of this throughout history, as far back as 409 BCE, when Xenophon of Athens actually experienced the same thing, except he didn't lose as many people. Now, the other way that honey can be used is as alcohol. When honey is turned into wine, it's called mead. And my favorite story about how mead was used in warfare was talked about in Conrad Berub's 2000 article titled War and Bees, Military Applications of War. Saint Olga in 946 Common Era invited enemies to her son's funeral. Now, why they went, I don't know, but what happened next was great. They all got drunk, and all 5,000 people were slain. Now, the accounts vary as to whether they were boiled to death or hacked to death, but either way, don't drink at a party where your enemy is hosting. It's generally not a good idea. So, now that you know all this about how insects have been used in warfare, how they've been used as just pain-causing instruments, how they've been used as biological weapons, and even how their honey can be used to kill victims, just think next time that you see a bee or a wasp, how much damage that they've done in the past. And think about how they've been used in warfare. Now, if you have any questions about any other ways that insects have been used in warfare, feel free to ask me.